Welcome back to Fly Fishing Rutland Water. As the new season is rapidly approaching, I wanted to give anyone new to Rutland Water a head start. A review of an entire season using all of the videos I've produced so far. I also recently received a nice surprise in the post from one of the channel viewers who has written a book about fish behaviour to help anglers catch more fish. The book is by Dan Bagur, who has a degree in freshwater and marine biology. For his final year thesis, he researched freshwater fish behaviour and subsequently published a book now available in hardback, paperback and Kindle via Amazon. He's read hundreds of scientific papers involving real experiments to study the impact of different factors on fish behaviour. I'm going to use this book to help explain what happened on Rutland Water last year. Each one of my videos is in fact a scientific experiment. To make the videos on the channel, I filmed over 200 hours of footage and created 47 videos fly fishing Rutland Water across an entire season under very different conditions. So let's get started and do a month-by-month review of what happened and to see if the book can help explain it. The season on Rutland now opens around the second week of March. Unfortunately, I have no March footage from last year as the reservoir didn't open until April due to COVID restrictions. But I do have footage of 4 locations: No Wading Point, Yellowstone, Old Hall Bay and Armley Wood from previous seasons. Daniel's book starts with a detailed description of fish physiology. Fish are cold-blooded, so have no ability to regulate their own body temperature. Temperature impacts how much or how little they move, and this impacts how much they have to eat to fuel that movement. Experiments from papers used to write the book demonstrate that when fish are exposed to different temperatures in laboratory conditions, even a small change in temperature can have a dramatic effect. When it's too hot or too cold, the fish become visibly distressed and want to move to water with a more desirable temperature. It's the Goldilocks principle. The fish don't like the water too hot or too cold. They want it just right and move to the depth that is just right for them. In March, the water is very cold. Despite warming up in the summer, over the winter months, the shallow water and the surface of the reservoir gradually cool down. And in March, it's probably at its coldest. This made me decide to develop a depth gradient map of Rutland Water based on satellite images, depth charts, and an Ordnance Survey map available in the Rutland Fishing Lodge. I used the contours to develop a temperature profile in winter, a bit like an infrared image taken from above to show the temperature gradient in the reservoir. Blue where it's cold and red where it's warmer. In winter, the fish move into the deeper water where the temperature is slightly higher. It's still very cold, so even there the fish's metabolism slows and the fish are very lethargic, living off their body fat and hardly moving or feeding over the winter months. If you've caught an overwintered fish, you know that they have used up nearly all of their body fat and are very emaciated. The deep water also contains more oxygen, so the fish can breathe more easily with less effort. So all of my early season spots have easy access to deep water and a sharp drop-off which enables the fish to find a depth that they are comfortable at. Early season, I always start with a weighted fly to take the line down into the deeper water and find the depth the fish are sitting at. I also move along the banks with pretty much every cast. The fish are not moving along the bank much. They sit deep down in the water and move up the contours as the sun warms the shallow water. Because they're moving, they use energy, so they need to feed. Coincidentally, the buzzers are also hatching in the shallow water. I use a 3-fly setup, the heavy fly on the point, and then 2 buzzers higher up. We now need to talk about colour. Fish have different sensitivities to colour depending on the clarity of the water. Red is a colour they see across the broadest range of conditions. There's a fascinating experiment described in Daniel's book that demonstrates this. A scientist had a tank of sticklebacks on his windowsill. Periodically, the fish would go absolutely bananas, and it coincided with the postal van passing his home. The fish saw red as a hostile threat and became agitated and displaying to try and chase away what they saw as a rival male. Sticklebacks have red cheeks, which we know is a sensitive colour, and they use it to display, to attract females, and to warn off rival suitors. Now, if I look at my fly box, all of my buzzer patterns have a red trigger point, or an orange cheek, which is right next to red in the colour spectrum. When the water is murky, fluorescent yellow, green or blue are the most visible to fish. My heavy point fly in March is a Pittsford P, which is a hybrid colour between yellow and green, and I use this fly as my weighted point fly for March and April. If the fish move up the contours into the shallows, I catch more on the buzzers. So I take off the heavy point fly and put on another buzzer, so I can target the higher layers of the water. If the buzzers stop catching, I swap to a cruncher, Dalbach or holographic Nemo, all with some red trigger points, just in case the fish are no longer feeding on buzzers, but on some other type of hatching insect. You can never tell where they'll be. On opening day in 2015 at No Wading Point, I was getting them on buzzers right on the surface, as the water had warmed up. Day after opening day, fishing Yellowstone, exactly as I described, immediate access to deep water, I fished with one of them on the point, and then two buzzers, different types of buzzer, because we know there's going to be buzzers hatching in the margins. So I'm covering 3 depths simultaneously. Heavy flying the point gets me down to the fish, and then I've got 2 other imitative patterns which will pick up the fish that are maybe moving up through the water. Now, I had a fabulous couple of sessions. One in Armley Wood, and that was just about 3 years ago. Another one in Yellowstone. In fact, I had a couple of brilliant sessions on Yellowstone on the Pittsford P, using a varied retrieve to anger the fish into taking when they were sulking in the deeper water. That technique also worked in Old Hall Bay a few days later, and again at Armley Wood in 2020. In that spot, the fish rose in the water later in the day, and I started to get them on buzzers and dalbachs higher in the water, whereas earlier in the day I was getting them on the Pittsford P. So at the 5 fly setup, a Pittsford P on the point, with 2 buzzers or nymphs on the droppers, and replacing the point fly with another buzzer or nymph, or even a booby to fish the washing line, is a great way to catch in March and early April. Just find a spot with easy access to deep water and keep moving and changing depth until you find the fish, and I guarantee you will hit one. And when they do take, the takes can be quite ferocious. The 2021 season started on the 1st of April. Although we had a very cold winter, March was quite mild and the water warmed up quite quickly. All of the spots I fished in April had good access to deep water: Yellowstone, Dickinson's Point, Old Hall and the Finches. April was classic early season tactics, but without using the Pittsford P, as the fish were way too high in the water. My first session was on Yellowstone, where I quickly found the fish were very close to the surface and feeding on buzzers fished almost static and just allowed to drift in the wind. I had a few fabulous sessions off Dickinson's Road End, which also has easy access to deeper water, and the point of the old road next to the fence is fabulous ambush territory. The Finches rewarded me with a hard-earned fish by keeping on the move, and I finished the month strong with a return visit to Yellowstone. End April, early May is when Rutland really starts to fish well. I discovered Transformer, where I'd never fished before, less than 5 minutes from home. I had taken some casting lessons from Rob Boddington and wanted to practice, so went to the spot closest to my house, only to find it was absolutely filled with fish. I fished it for nearly a month, and the fish were definitely on the move now, moving along the banks, following the contours, swimming up in the current and feeding as they swam. That exact behaviour was described in the book. And it was possible to stand in one spot and wait for the fish to come past. I saw this in New Zealand Bay when the wind was blowing in and across the bay, creating a circular current that the fish were following. Coming into the bank from the deep water, along the bank, up to what I call the magic tree, before going back out into the deeper water. I learned that you can fish in the sunshine if the fish are feeding with the sun behind them. The fish fed confidently, swimming up the current in the margins into the wind with the sun behind them. I ended up staying at the tree, seeing the fish coming up the bank in pods and throwing the flies out to intercept them when they came past. They then went out to the deeper water, following a circular pattern but moving deeper down on the way back, downwind with the sun in their eyes, causing them to move deeper down in the water. As the month went on, the action switched from buzzers to nymphs, but always higher in the water. The water was also much clearer, and the fish were switching to the colours they see best in clear water: white and fluorescent blue and red. White and red were both in my new favourite Dalbach nymph and the old favourite holographic red Nemo. Next year, I definitely need to try fluorescent blue on some of my buzzers and nymphs. May was when Rutland really started to switch on, and the first brown trout showed up at Dickinson's and then at Transformer, where I had a few that must have been recently stocked. I fished Transformer for nearly 3 weeks in May, with the odd blank at Greenbank, where the fish still hadn't shown up. Dickinson's Point was also good throughout the month. The first 2 weeks of June were also very good, but the weather started to get much hotter. The fish were much more active on the surface, and I discovered the foam daddy and suspended nymph patterns. You could start to see fry in the margins, which requires you to move to smaller patterns, size 14 and even 16 to match the size of the tiny pin fry. But for me, it was daddies all the way, in Old Hall Bay and in New Zealand Point, where I had 6 in 1 hour in the evening, and Transformer, which was still fishing well. I still had no luck at Green Blanc. In Old Hall, even on the hottest day of the year, I saw the same feeding behaviour I described earlier, with the fish moving around in a big circular pattern, but now very much feeding on dries on the surface. I even caught a fish within 10 minutes of starting fishing on the hottest day of the year, on the 14th of June, when it was a sweltering 29 degrees centigrade. I had a cracking end to that evening when I broke my pride and joy Loomis GLX distance. It snapped on camera. As the month went on, the fish were still feeding, but were harder to tempt due to the warming water. Dries and washing line worked well, and were generally able to attract fish, but there were more follows than hookups. It was way too hot for comfort, so the fish moved into the deeper water where it was cooler and more comfortable. They still came into the shallows to feed, and I finally got some specimen fish in Green Bank right at the end of June, with a personal best brown and a few big rainbows over a great 3-day period. I was using daddies and Midas flies, which I'd never really used before. It was very late in the season before Green Bank came onto form. The bigger fish also showed up in New Zealand Bay, and I was still happily ambushing them by the magic tree. Once we got into July, it got really tough. By this time, the shallows are way too hot for comfort, and the warm water also contains less dissolved oxygen, so the fish moved out into the deeper water. Even after switching to the boats in July, it was very hard to catch fish anywhere else other than in the deep water in the main basin, where the water was still cooler and where the aerators pumping air into the reservoir provided great sport with sinking lines and lures. My last session in summer was on the 15th of July, in what felt like perfect conditions with cool temperatures and overcast skies, but the water was still way too warm. I fluked one fish when not even fishing. I was eating a sandwich. But then chatting to Craig Barr at the end of the day on the dock, he told me he was having 8 weeks off. I switched to Draycote and Grapham, and although still hard, I did have some very good sessions there. I didn't plan to start fishing again on Rutland until September, but because I'd never fished the back end of the season for over 10 years, I decided to go out on a scouting trip and photograph the weed beds around the peninsula, at the Finches, Barnhill Creek and Old Hall Bay, so I had an idea of the best spots to fish in. For some reason, it felt fishy, so I took out my new 5-weight rod and gave it a go. I had a magical 3 days with 8 fish, all around £4, that fought like steelhead ripping me down to the backing numerous times. I caught the first fish on a suspender gold-ribbed hare's ear. Then I got them on poppers, stripped back across the weed beds. When I cleaned the fish I caught on the first day, it was packed full of snails. So I tied up a simple snail imitation and caught a fish on it with the very first cast. But the fish were only there for 3 days. I think they basically cleaned the weed beds out. I also think they were still in the deep water, but were coming into the weed bed for the all-you-can-eat snail buffet. September was magical. I had a hunch that the first place the big fish would show would be around the weed beds on the point of the peninsula, at Barnhill Creek, Spud Bay, and also across at the Normanton Bank, all very close to the deepest water. I had an amazing day on the 1st of September, by which time the water had really started to cool in the shallows. I hooked an absolute monster brown trout within the first few minutes of fishing at Spud Bay. I had it on for about 5 to 10 minutes and over the net, but I failed to land it, and I lost it on a deep run under the boat. I felt awful, and even catching a few really good rainbows on the other side of the same bay and buying a new hardy rod in the lodge didn't help ease the pain. I decided to give Normanton a try, as it was a spot that I'd done well at. I now know it's because it's right next to a deep water hole. With contours and weed beds, the fish can easily move into as the water warms up. I caught a second double figure brownie, which I landed and released. The release footage was absolutely brilliant, and it was my first ever double figure brownie, so I was obviously delighted. I had some more great boat sessions. One involved fishing with 3 completely different setups and catching fish on all 3. It shows there are lots of ways to catch fish when you know where the fish are. That day it was poppers, a competition 4-fly setup, and the last fish was on a dry fly. I got a tip-off early in October from Craig Barr that there were fish around Armley Wood, so I went down at dawn the following morning and caught a big rainbow on one of my very first casts. Well, massive thanks to Craig Barr for putting me in the right spot. This one's about the £5 mark. Come on, there you go. And there it goes. Safely back into the depths. Massive thanks to Craig Barr. You put me in exactly the right spot, Craig. Thank you so much. That's the biggest rainbow of the season so far. Cheers, mate. I had a frustrating boat session with Tony Mould at the very same spots, with loads of follows but no hookups. We ended up catching in bright sunshine and a flat calm in the always reliable deep water off the Normanton Bank. I was fishing popper minkies and dry daddies for the whole of October. The follows are so exciting, and the takes are even more so. It's truly explosive when they take the fly when pulling poppers. I had another specimen brown in a boat off the point of Armley Wood. Again, this was on the deep water drop-off. It was over £8 and did a brilliant swim past the boat when we released it. Dan's book mentions that dawn and dusk are the very best times to catch fish, due to the favourable light conditions. He also discusses how weed beds consume oxygen at night, but produce it during the day. This suggests that morning may not always be the best time. The light is ideal, but the weed beds are lacking oxygen, so they won't be attractive for the fry or the fish feeding on them. I thought maybe evening would be better, as the water had warmed up and the fry would move into the weed beds and the big fish would surely follow. The book was bang on. I did catch at dawn, but I got another 2 specimens right on the point of sunset 2 nights in a row. The book is right. And another nice one. Around the 4, maybe just over £4 mark. And away. We do know where the fish are if we do our homework properly. When the new season starts on the 11th of March, I'm going to a whole set of completely new spots to see if I can use the book to catch more fish, by picking spots with the right characteristics and using the right flies and tactics to better target the fish. I hope this will create an even bigger database of videos to help anyone coming to Rutland Water have a clearer idea of where the fish are. Please hit the like button, and I hope you subscribe to the channel to see the next full year of my fishy adventures. Fly fishing Rutland Water. Thanks for watching.